Now, this is a fun video to do. It's a fun topic to do, because realistically it comes down to something rather basic. Why and how do small empires work, and how do they survive as long as they do? How do they exist? How do they keep functioning? And realistically, some of these empires weren't that small. They really weren't. These empires were not necessarily as small as we might presume. They're also not as short-running as we might presume. One of the interesting things to me is we're talking about the Swedish, the Portuguese, and the Netherlands, i.e. the Dutch empires. You know, and it's what were the factors that allowed Sweden, Portugal, and Netherlands to be contenders on the global stage? You know, what allowed them to have empires? What allowed them to be important? And, well, I'm going to go for a very discursive route. I have to admit, there's only going to be 3 slides in this video, so I'm not sure how long it's going to be. It could be very long, it could be very short. But there's a reason I'm going to where I'm going. Because the roles and reasons for them being as powerful as they were, as much a presence as they were, change as time goes on. And the moment it became about all 3, I thought, well, ooh, that can either be 3 different presentations, because each is going to change, or it can be a continuous presentation, but it'll be very short in terms of number of slides. Because the moment I start putting in slides for each bit, for each nation, then there's going to be a dozen slides each, and it's going to become a massive thing. Whereas if I get restricted to 1 slide each, and just talk, then hopefully it doesn't get so long that it becomes onerous. So here we go. What allowed Sweden, Portugal, and the Netherlands to build empires? Well, we're going to wreck the order straight away. We're going to start off with the earliest empire. We're then going to move to the next earliest empire. And then we're going to move to the shortest empire. Because guess what? The earliest empire is also the longest empire. It only finishes in 1999. The second longest empire finishes in 1975. In contrast, the shortest empire is rather short and sharp. Emphasis on the sharp. Emphasis on the sharp. They're all very different in their styles and their approach to the world and their reasons for empire. Realistically, if you're the case of Portugal, well, you are the one who achieves the longest running empire, 1415 to 1999. There aren't many empires which last 584 years. And let's be honest, Portugal is not exactly the country you necessarily think about having an empire for that long, but they did, and it was successful. What you start to realise very early on about the Portuguese is that they are building an empire because of trade. Because they need to be trading, they need to be making money, because if they don't, they're going to get swallowed by Spain. Yes, they have their own sort of Reconquista, they have their own creation, they have their own people and their own existence, but it's very difficult with Spain as your next door neighbour. Spain is often trying to push to take over, and times does. Times Portugal gets their own independence back. It's a constant tussle, because they are quite such a powerful neighbour. And rather like the Dutch, we're talking about in a bit, for the Portuguese, if you cannot go east, you have to go west, and west is the sea. So you're going out to sea? Well, you might as well go and look for what you can find in the world. And they can find a lot. And the major flow of money throughout history has been global. Taking goods from where they are prolific to where they are scarce. That's how you make your money. Moving services from where they're prolific to where they are scarce. Providing people with something which they need, which they want, which they desire. People usually settle the needs first, the wants next, and the desires last. Most people, when they're spending money. But there again, lots of people are probably going to be competing for the wants. There's going to be a never-ending competition for the needs because it's going to be the largest market, so there's going to be lots of people competing over it, which means it's going to have the lowest margins. Wants are going to have higher margins because there's going to be slightly less competition, but realistically, desires have the highest margins. Desires have the highest profit chance. Cost to the amount you can sell it for. And desires usually are what are afforded by the people who have money. So the people who have money to spend. Usually the rich people. And that's how you can make yourself rich. Because you're able to supply them with what they need. Portugal has a problem though. They do not have the population either of Britain. They do not have the industrial might either of Britain. And they do not have the natural aquatic moat that Britain is blessed with when it comes to dealing with their major continental neighbour. So they can't send out large amounts of forces. They can't send out armies to secure territories. They have to rely on factories. They have to rely on economic hubs. And one of the interesting things about the Portuguese Empire is they do two things very well. They sail around the world and manage to get back again. And they pick great harbours. And by hook or by crook, by deal or canoodle, frigate, they'll throw in the whole caboodle if they need to, they get access to those harbours. Because they want to trade. They want to make money. I know there's a lot of talk with the Portuguese and the Spanish empires about the spread of Catholicism and religion around the world, and oh yes, that is a useful thing for them to cloak themselves in the majesty of God's grace and a veneer of, yes, we're doing something which is altruistic. But that's just motivation for young people who really should know better. It's all about money when it comes down to it. And honestly, the Portuguese Empire was better at this than the Spanish one. If you look at the Portuguese Empire throughout history, they regularly run on more efficient lines than the Spanish, and that's actually, it both serves to protect them from Spain, but also makes them more attractive to Spain. Often the Spanish king is looking at Portugal and going, I want their money. How is it they do so well with the money, and yet we have the silver fleets? They're bringing in spices. We're bringing in silver. How does this work? It's quite simple. Silver is needed for trade. Spice is desired for life. It works. Also, whereas there is already silver in Europe, there's already silver moving around and going on in places, it's far harder to hide if you nick spices to move them on, because they are a far, far harder commodity to come by. It's a dirty trick, but it works. They have a monopoly, and they can use that monopoly to provide them the ability to secure that monopoly. The Portuguese run a very, very efficient trade network. And again, all these ports, look at them. They're all good places to stop and trade. I remember once showing them to a student, and went, oh, that must be when they had to pull in with their ships. And you go, well, to an extent. But also look at them. You need far more around the coast of Africa. And they do almost reach Australia. They do get very, very close to Australia. But realistically, for the Portuguese, Australia would never have been worth it. They don't have the supplies, they don't have the populace, they don't have the goods they need to sell to anyone. And that's the other interesting thing about Portugal. Despite having kings with the titles of Henry the Navigator, etc., and all these things, they are very, very focused in what they do. They are very focused in how they approach their empire, in how they run their empire, in how they organize their empire. Their empire is a trading empire. It's about economics. And when things stop being economically viable, they cut them. When they stop being economically sensible, they cut them. If they can push the costs of controlling an area onto someone else, and they can only have to do the trading, they cut it. This is one of the most ruthlessly focused, efficient empires the world has ever seen. And honestly, there are modern corporations which could learn efficiency from the Portuguese government and the way they run their empire. Every time you hear the phrase business is inherently more efficient than governments, no, it isn't. There are many businesses which are incredibly inefficient. And there are many governments in various periods which have been incredibly efficient. It all depends on timing, place, and motivation. The Portuguese had to be. Their strength was never their numbers. Their strength was their ability to move goods. Their strength was not their geographical position. Their strength was their ability to use that position to provide them with the basis of getting goods. They basically went, oh, the Spanish have locked us off from going to America. Okay, we'll go the other way. And they went the other way. This divided the world in half, according to a pope. Spain could have one half of the world, Portugal the other. It was a useful treaty to stop war between two major Catholic powers. That was the theory. The practice was, it gave one not enough to be the world power in terms of its goods, because it didn't have access to the endless silver. And it meant that the other really didn't manage to get a material which was actually profitable enough to really see its economy soar. You see, the thing is, silver comes in its raw form, it's already money. You can spend it. You don't have to invest in infrastructure, you don't have to invest in anything to spend silver, you can just spend it. Whereas Portugal, they had to invest in all these things. They had to invest. And if you consider the infrastructure basis of Portugal, there is a good reason why in the Napoleonic Wars during the Peninsular Campaign, the British are far happier to base their forces out of Portugal than they are Spain. Because the infrastructure was usually better. Why? Because again, as I said, silver comes in, you can spend it. Spices come in, you can't spend spices, you have to move them to places where they can be bought by people who wish to use them. You have to store them. You have to maintain them, you have to look after all these things, and you have all the ships and things you have to store and look after. It's not instant money, it's effort. And that's the difference. With that being said, let's then consider the Dutch Empire. Now, the Dutch are probably the classic trading empire. They are who everyone thinks about when you go, wow, an empire built upon trade. It's usually the Dutch. And realistically, that's sensible. We are talking about the nation which was one of the most, literally, they were crypto bros before crypto bros was a thing. You just have to look up the tulip craze to realise that the Dutch have a unhealthy history of jumping into whatever economics was going on there and trying to make a maximum profit and developing it up. the Dutch never give anything less than 150% of themselves. They throw everything into it. They will either be absolutely against it or absolutely for it. And I say this knowing I'm talking in, vast simplification of a national culture and national identity. But if you spend enough time around a collection of Dutch people, not an individual, but a collection, you soon realise that this, whilst it's a vast simplification, it's also very true. If Dutch people are believing in something and want to do something, everything goes into that thing. Everything. And they will do it with their whole soul and everything else they can grab. And if they don't, they won't. Now, the Portuguese, they have a traditional organisation. They have a monarchy, they have council, and these things which allow them to sort of build up their infrastructure. And they have to invest in infrastructure because of the trade they're doing. The Dutch have trade. The Dutch come to empire from a trading perspective. They're trying to trade with places. And they realise they need to have factories to go and trade on them, and they need to have these ports they can trade into. And then they find that those ports get attacked. Okay, so they need to fortify them. And once you start fortifying them, then you have to have a garrison living there. And garrisons living there are far more than a few merchants. So people start to have families because you have shops there and you have goods there. And before you know it, you have a settlement. And here you have the fact that the Dutch people themselves are great farmers. But Netherlands, whilst it's got very good very good quality agricultural land and a culture of very good farming, it doesn't have a lot of land. And there's a lot of second sons, a lot of family members who are going, this land will never be mine. And that explains a lot of what happens down in the Boers, in South Africa area. But yes, the Dutch are going around the world finding places not just to call empire, but to trade. And usually, their empire comes about as a defense of that trade. Dealing with local rulers, expanding and expanding and expanding. And again, there's a lot of interplay between them and the Portuguese. One of the interesting things you get on this period, and realistically, is the free trading empires, i.e. the empires which exist as trading entrepôts and expand from that. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British empires do a lot of working together. They will fight, trust me, they will fight, but often they also work together. There's often a lot of pragmatism going on. So there's a reason, if we go back to here, look at some of those dots, those red spots around the world where the Portuguese Empire was. You look here and you go, oh, there's a lot of orange spots in similar places. Oh, was that where the Dutch also had access? And then there's always Brazil and Brazil. You see, trade matters. We like to believe in the modern world that we've invented globalism, that we've invented the global trading network, that we are something special, or that globalism is something new, and that prior to this, no, people didn't trade around the world. No, they have been. For pretty much as long as there have been settled communities on this earth producing materials, they've also been consuming materials, which means there has been trade. And that trade could be many years for goods to pass from point A to point B. It could be many months to point A to point B. Or weeks. It could be by land. Remember, the Silk Road is not just a modern Chinese project. It's something which has been around for a very, very long time. Alexander the Great's expeditions, Alexander the Great's expansion of his empire was conquering the Silk Road. And people often ask me, why does Alexander the Great go east, not west? Because why go to one end of the nearest end of the Silk Road when you can go towards the furthest end of the Silk Road and control more of the Silk Road and therefore be able to charge more in taxes and make more money from that trade. It's rather obvious when you think like that, isn't it? The more of the Silk Road you control, the more of the trade routes between East and West you control, the more money you make on that trade. And that's the big source of revenue. And people like Alexander the Great and the people around that point, they understand that. I've had that conversation with people, they go, they don't have our higher form of economics and understand. And I go, no, they might not have all the economic theory we have today, but they're not stupid, and money is money. And people tend to figure out, where's the money coming from? Is it coming from the West? Or is it coming from the East? I will go East. Make more money. The Dutch are just the same. They are in a wonderful position in Europe to trade with the rest of Europe. They have connections to rivers, they have connections via land, they are in a good location to trade up and down the coasts with various states, including, of course, well, the various states which make up Germany over its time period, Holy Roman Empire, all the sort of things it becomes. They are a good location. And also, they are a good point for the British trade to enter Europe when it's annoyed with the French or the Spanish or everyone else, and then trade on with other people. Because again, once a trade arrives in the Netherlands, if they are neutral, well then it's just moved onto a Dutch ship and then it goes to somewhere else. It works so well. So well. And the thing was, just like Venice, Milan, all the other nations before them who had, well, those have been trading city-states, before them who had used their positions to provide themselves, make themselves an economic hub, that's what the Dutch were doing. They're making themselves an economic hub. And most of the time, when they lost territory to the British, they still got to trade in those spaces. When the British took over New Amsterdam and turned it into New York, the Dutch were annoyed, but they kept on trading. Because they could. Because once things were settled, that was fine. And then that meant the Dutch didn't have to provide the security. They didn't have to provide the troops. They didn't have to start charging people taxes. They could just keep trading. So the Dutch Empire continues on as this sort of trading organisation. And again, for the Dutch, they have the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, which is, in its own way, just as brutal as the British East India Company. But realistically, they never get quite as good at becoming a nation state as the British East India Company. Oh. That's one of those organisations which you either laugh at just how they frigging achieve it, or you just spend your entire time going, oh god, then they did that. Oh no. Because, realistically, neither of those organisations should have achieved the great things they achieved. They really shouldn't. There are sieges in Taiwan between massive, or Formosa as it was sometimes called at the time, between massive Chinese armies and Dutch forces. Sieges which go on for months, years. And the Dutch win them. They are outnumbered, surrounded by a force which, okay, yes, it was differential in technology, but not behind them at the time in technology. This is one of the things you have to remember about the Chinese, is they have gunpowder weapons. They have different styles of how they use gunpowder weapons. They have different forms of cannon. The European cannon tends to run as heavier. But to be honest, that makes sort of sense when you consider the necessities and the sheer number you need if you're China versus the nations in Europe. And also the access to the various materials. And this is one of the reasons why you're trading, of course. One of the reasons you're trading is because, believe it or not, Europe has materials that those nations want. We often talk about how China only wants to trade in silver. That's the Chinese government. They only want to trade in silver. The Chinese merchants, though, there are various resources they want to trade for. And they're quite happy to do it. Sometimes it's officially, sometimes unofficially. Sometimes control of a place like Formosa is a great place because, you see, the merchant ship goes out from China, from a port in China, let's say, and it arrives at a port in China. And where the goods it leaves the port in China with, the first port, might not be the goods it arrives at the second port with. But it's all able to have worked. And the whole thing about this empire is, again, it's an economic empire. It's about making money. And that's also what gives them their power. Because money also means information. Merchants talk. And the usual advantage the Dutch have for many, many years is the fact that they have access to some of the best information in the world. We talk today, and the example usually given is Israel, a nation which is surrounded by nations which could be enemies or are enemies, tends to invest a lot in its intelligence arm to get information. The Dutch weren't saying from a government perspective, it wasn't the government investing in it, but the various admiralties and merchant houses of the Netherlands knew that that information was critical to their economic survival. After all, to make a profit, you either have to be smarter than everyone in the room, you have to be better than everyone in the room, or you have to be first. Whilst you're smart, other people are going to be just as smart, so you can't guarantee that. Being better, well, other empires are bigger. They're going to be able to bring more mass. So being first is where you get your profit, and you can only be first if you have the information first. So that means investing in information that's useful. And that's, again, something which the Dutch do a lot of. With that being said, we then have to move on to our third minor empire, the Swedish Empire. Now, the Swedish Empire are different. They have the advantage that they're not being surrounded by massive powers at the point at which they start declining. They're surrounded by a lot of disjointed little powers. And realistically, the Swedes are organised. The Swedes are focused. The Swedes are resource rich, but not human resource rich. And so they're pushing out to expand their territories, to gain people, to gain more security for themselves. And that's their expansion of their empire. They are small but mighty, focused and getting larger. It's the common thing if we look at history. When you have an organised power who's larger than their neighbours, and their neighbours are disorganised, then they tend to start to absorb their neighbours. Sometimes it's through commercial or cultural or other means, marriage alliances. Sometimes it's at the point of a spear. I know history likes to say the point of a sword, but let's be honest, it's the spears which tend to do the work, not the swords. Axes, they'll do the work. Warhammers, yeah. It's rarer, it's the swords. And they didn't stop there. They also went further. They went around the world and had little bits of empire around the world. Most people forget the Swedes had some territories in North America and some territories in Africa and some countries. You know, they had a presence. It's kind of confusing, but they do have presence. Those latter bits are, to an extent, their desire to build up a trading empire because they know they couldn't build up a land empire strong enough. But realistically, for the Swedes, the problem was their land empire comes with borders. And they have to defend those borders. Which means they are constantly in trouble of not having enough manpower to do the job that they want to do. As long as they're on the offensive and they're tying down enemy resources in their territories, i.e. not in the Swedish territories, it's fine. The moment they start to lose their central organisation, the moment they start to fight amongst themselves, they fall apart quicker than their counterparts around them had. They really do. And realistically, that's because of the position they've put themselves in. They've put themselves in a scenario where they have expanded to the point they can't defend things. Now, if they had been able to, if they'd been able to keep their centralised government going a bit longer, if they'd been able to modernise some of their infrastructure a bit more, if they had been able to... There's lots of what-ifs with the Swedish Empire. It's one of those empires which is really kind of interesting to look at, because it comes so close to reaching critical mass. They need a critical mass of population under their control that's loyal to them. They need a critical mass of population that is capable of delivering what they need to deliver. They need a critical mass of population that's capable of working together. Realistically, they need the whole rest of Norway and the whole of Denmark united under one banner. And then they have a chance. Then they'd have a chance, because they'd have a core which would be self-sufficient and defensible enough that they could expand from it. The trouble is, they didn't get that. They didn't. They delivered some hammer blows to Russia, some hammer blows to the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, some hammer blows to all sorts of powers. They ripped up Northern Europe like a ravaging horde. Yet, like a horde, they were transitory. They were strong for a moment. They were a bright, shining light. But there is a reason they are the shortest lasting empire on this list, this discussion. We had, at the beginning, an empire which lasted 484 years, or 584 years. Then we have an empire which lasts a decent, and I will say this, decent 180 years. Okay, 1595 to 1975 versus 1415 to 1999. There's a difference going on. But 1611 to 1721, 110 years. They are a mighty candle in the wind when they come up. And they deserve to be. They are, when you look at their neighbours, they're organised. They have infrastructure. They have some form of centralised government. They have resources. They have people. But they don't have enough of any of those things. And because they're not pursuing an economic empire first, providing with the basis and long-term funding to actually secure that, they're constantly in financial issues. These days we look at the Scandinavian nations and we look at the resources and the things they have which have helped buoy up their economies, and we can't imagine them being as poor as they were then, but they really were. They needed a lot of investment to get access to those materials. They needed a lot of time to develop and stability, and they hadn't had that. You know, we often forget that Viking is something you go and do if you're Scandinavian. You go a Viking. And that's where we get the name Viking from. And they were Norsemen. People from the north. But the reason they're going a Viking is to find resources, to either bring it back home or take it and settle down there. And that's why when people go a Viking, they often turn into traders, settlers, as well as warriors, raiding. It's everything combined. It's not just one thing. There's a lot of motivations to go a Viking. Because where you're coming from is hard, harsh, and lacks the resources. You want to really thrive and grow. You have a population which is on the cusp of growing so often, so capable, so productive, and yet they don't have the resources they need. So of course they're driven outwards. Of course they go to search for them. And the result is this. The result is the fighting. The result is the Swedish Empire. The result is the fact that the three crowns of Norway, Sweden and Denmark never seem to be getting along. Because unless they are united, they are divided because they're squabbling over the same resources. And that's me being polite about it in some ways. Whereas, if they manage to control it, well, then they control the entrance of the Baltic. And controlling the entrance into the Baltic, and controlling as much of the Baltic coastline as they would, especially with Sweden's territories in Finland, that gives you pretty much control of the Baltic. And that's a great basis to build from economically. There's enough trade going around there, you could have turned all of it into a Swedish lake. If you'd really wished. If you'd really been able to unite and motivate the forces needed. Still, they invested in infrastructure. Still, they grew the capabilities they could. But there were limits to what they could achieve with the resources and people they had at their disposal. And that's really the hard thing for them. If you go to Karlskrona, you'll see a beautiful, beautiful museum where they show you a lot of their navy and a lot of the stuff that was built there. And you can look at the ships and you can look at the ideas they had. And it's gorgeous. It is gorgeous. But it is also a reminder that without much effort, they could have been so much more if they'd been able to put in that effort. That they were always kept permanently trapped by their own geography, their own circumstances, on the cusp of achieving much more. So there you go. 3 minor empires. Why they got powerful? Because they were centralized and organized and they were motivated to survive. And why ultimately they couldn't achieve more. So I'm going to finish on the shameless book plug, which I know is unusual for me, but it works for this time. So finishing on a shameless book plug, and that's not normal, is it? No, it's not normal. But I'm doing this because, well, 2 reasons. One, when this video comes out, and when it comes out it's going to be an interesting time for me, because who knows where in the world I'm going to be on the 16th of October. Probably somewhere in Japan, hopefully somewhere in Japan. But again, it's going to be wherever I am, thanks to you and your support and your kindness. So thank you. Thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing. Thank you for helping the channel grow. Thank you for all those things. And the question I'm going to finish off on, and that's for these sort of minor powers and suitable, is that I want you to think about your own nations. Because in many ways, every nation is an empire in miniature. Every nation is. If you think about them, if we go back to their original organisations, most of them were far smaller groupings. England, where I've grown up, there were many tribes, there were many different groups, and it eventually comes together, it eventually organised itself. And realistically, those tribes are doing the same thing as these small empires. Some managed to get rich by trading. Some manage to secure themselves through alliances. Some get rich by seizing territory. And eventually the one which has the ability to do enough of all 3 grows to dominate. Grows to become powerful. And gets to define where the capital city is. Gets to define where the organisation is. And you might think, well, hang on, London was settled by the Romans, wasn't it? And it was a settlement before that, so that's the Romans who decided that. But after the Romans left, there were multiple tribes, there were multiple kingdoms. These things grow and ebb and flow. They also fall. That's what happens in history. And it's often the powers who think they are going to be the next big power in charge who find themselves falling the fastest, because it is far easier and far nastier to fall from number 2 than it is to fall from number 1. It really is. So I want you to think about how your countries were formed. And think about why the powers that ended up forming it, the smaller parts of the nation that ended up forming the base of your country, managed to achieve that. Be really interested to hear what you think. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And take care. Poodle doesn't like hearing I'm going away. He likes it when I stay here and give him cuddles. No, any big love. What have we got coming up next? Ooh, next week is going to be Admiral Nelson, a very British god of war. Oh, that'd be fun, won't it? You good, Poodle? Okay. If you get down for a second. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and thank you.